going to be a fun day. A couple of just little odds and ends before I get started. Brian mentioned D65. We are actually, I'm leaving this afternoon to go to Dallas to do a workshop. If anybody is interested, we will extend a special on-one discount of $250 off. It does start on Thursday. And the other site that is Digital Photo Destinations, where we are actually doing lots of fairly exotic travel stuff, John Paul Caponegro and myself. And it's from there that we just got back from a trip to Patagonia and Antarctica. And the images I'm going to work on today are all from the Antarctica portion. This is really neat for me because as someone who's been involved in Lightroom since sort of day one, you know, every time things change, you know, Brian understands you have you're hesitant and you go, oh, you know, I can't believe they're changing this. And in essence, the entire develop module has changed. And when I first started playing with it, my reaction was, oh, you know, I can't believe they've sort of redone the develop module. I have to tell you, I am absolutely blown away by it. And the image that you see on your screen is everything he show you has all been done exclusively in Lightroom. And there are things in this particular image that there would just be no way of doing only in Lightroom. It would be classic Photoshop stuff. And really exciting to have the ability to do this kind of stuff. So I'm going to start out easy, and then we'll build up to some more interesting images, I should say. So let me just go to the grid, and I think the one I'm going to start with is this one. And you know, this is the unretouched, I should say, original. Pretty amazing iceberg. A sidebar story. You know, we go out in the Zodiac, so there are a bunch of rules in Antarctica, like you're not allowed to go on an iceberg. You know, of course, I have to. You're not allowed to ever go underneath an iceberg because, of course, it could fall. But you get near these things, and they are, I mean, it is just unbelievable. So officially, this picture was not taken in a Zodiac underneath the iceberg. It was officially taken with what we called the extension pole. The extension pole is an imaginary device that reaches way underneath an iceberg and then captures the frame. So I think you can probably buy those at B&H. Anyhow, I'm going to go into the develop module. And as I work through this, I'm going to explain what each of the panels are, what's new here, and go from the unretouched image to the retouched image in essence, and then we'll do a back and forth and show you the differences. So the way I typically start out, the very first thing I like to do, and this has already been done on import, is I actually apply a custom, using the X-Ray Color Checker Passport, I actually use a custom profile. So the profile was applied on import. Normally you would have Adobe 98 or something in here. I have the one I specifically built in Antarctica for the 1DS Mark II. I'm going to typically do some basic things first, like before even getting developed. I'm going to turn on lens corrections. I'm going to go to auto, which is going to you know, find the profile for my Canon 14mm, which is what it is. One new thing that we have in the beta, which is rockin', is chromatic aberration is no longer part actually of the lens correction. We've made it a separate slider, so it's actually a separate checkbox. It is far more accurate. And if you have any images that show chromatic problems, I think you'll be absolutely blown away to try this checkbox and watch how instantly, you know, almost all traces of any chromatic issue disappear. I'm then going to go up and I'm going to do some basic sharpening on this image first. And I have a basic preset. What I'm going to do is just zoom into some areas that have better detail, like this area. And I'm going to press down my Option key. And by holding down the Option key, I am changing the image into grayscale. You can see that it's soft there. You can see as I go all the way up here, it's reticulated. You can actually see those little dots in there. I want to back off to the point where I'm getting a decent amount of sharpening without having any reticulation, which on this image is just about where we are there. I'm going to go to radius. Same thing. I'm looking for edge detail here. So you can see at 0.5 I have absolutely nothing. At 3 I have way too much. Again, I'm going to be looking for definition. Where I first begin to get definition, typically it's going to be somewhere between 0.8 and 1.8, and I'm right about 1.6, 1.7 on this image. Detail, again, pressing down the Option key, that's 0, that's 100. A little tougher to tell detail in this image, although you can see when it's pushed all the way up, you can see the reticulation and the accentuated lines there. I'm going to bring it back to just where I begin to start to see that line pattern, which is just about here. And then the big one for me is masking. And at 0, we are applying sharpening everywhere. At 100, I am constraining it only to the highlight edges. And basically, I want to apply it so that I see all of my edges in this image. And on most images, it's going to be somewhere between 10 to 25. This image, I'm actually pretty good right in here at about 12. So I get that stuff sort of out of the way. I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to come up here now to my basic panel. Color balance is as shot. It's actually totally cool for me. I have no problem with the color balance. And now we can start tweaking. Couple of things to note. You'll notice that the panel is entirely different than Lightroom 3. The controls make a lot more sense. I'll explain what each one does as I'm using it. One very big difference in the beta, and again, there will be some different features in the final release. Things may change. I would never use anything here, consider it to be permanent, but you know, we're headed certainly in the right direction. And the neat thing now is that we're used to be able to take sliders and only push them a certain amount before you started to have artifacting and other issues. All these sliders can now get pegged in either direction, and Lightroom does an amazing job with it. So starting with exposure, exposure is, and we've become much more literal. I mean, this is more like the way a photographer thinks. Exposure is exactly what it says. The overall exposure, plus or minus f-stops. So, you know, darkening the image globally or lightening the image globally. And I'm going to just lighten it a hair, somewhere's about here. Then I'm going to crank contrast. And my goal here, and again, I think it's important to say, one of the things that you know, people go, how do you go about adjusting an image? And instead of just playing with sliders, one of the things that I do, and I learned this from a dear friend Jeff Shiwi, and Jeff says, have the image talk to you. You know, ask the image what it wants to have done to it. And when I, you know, literally when I talk to my screen here, what I want to have done is I want to accentuate all these lines in the ice. I want to accentuate the shadows on the deeper shadows on the underside, and accentuate the light coming through. That's sort of a general thing I'd try to accomplish here. So highlights, actually I can push contrast even more. Highlights is my mid-tone highlights, if you will, meaning that whites are my brightest highlights. Highlights are my, you know, my next level of highlight. Shadows are my lower end shadows. Blacks are my darkest shadows. A very good methodology to go through when you are first starting to use this, and you will certainly get a hang of what the sliders do. I would suggest you start out using only exposure and contrast. Don't touch any other slider. When you feel comfortable with what contrast and exposure do, then add highlight and shadows to the mix. Once you are then comfortable with highlight and shadows and exposure and contrast, then go ahead and add whites and blacks. If you start out and immediately start thinking you know what each one of these sliders do, you're going to become extremely frustrated. So, that said, I am going to first, I want to bring down or darken my shadows. So I'm going to bring down my shadows a bit. Then I want to bring down even my darker shadows a little bit more. So I'm going to bring down my blacks just a height about here. Now I want to punch up my highlights. I want to accentuate these lines through the image. So I'm going to open up my highlights. And we can take these pretty far. I'm going to open up my whites, or my brightest highlights. Actually not that much because I'm looking at some areas out here. I'm going to crank clarity, and clarity has been totally redone in Lightroom 4 Beta. I'm going to add a bit of vibrance. And already we've gone from that to that, which is pretty amazing. And now what I would typically do is to start playing on a local level and doing specific little things. So I'm going to open up my localized adjustments, and you'll see now we have the ability to paint on some really cool things. We can actually paint on color temperature. We can paint out noise. We can paint in sharpness. We can paint out moire. And of course we have the same controls here that match the controls in the basic panel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with a brush, because I really want to accentuate these shadows a bit. I'm going to drop down my shadows and crank up contrast a bit, make my brush smaller, and just start out painting in some contrast and darkening some of these shadow areas. And again, you get the idea here. And I'm not going to completely finish all these images. I just want you to get an idea of what's happening. But very, very easy to do this. Actually, I probably should turn auto masking on, because it's going to find those edges even easier. And right now, I'm just going along those areas of shadow, accentuating those shadows over here. Whoops, that's probably a bit much. Bring up the blue. And that was probably a bit overdone there, so I'm going to just lighten that one. And typically what I would have done, what I really probably should have done, is done in essence the equivalent of another layer, but right about there is good. I hit return and I set that one. Now I have another new one, and I can go forward. Very, very neat, because we have the ability to do all kinds of neat things, including I can paint on just color temperature. So if I wanted to cool parts of this image more, I could, for example, just take the slider, make a temperature slider towards tungsten, and I'm not saying I necessarily like this, but I can paint on, blue, or make the iceberg bluer. They are already significantly blue. Or I could warm that part and take the temperature of something, up higher as well, all the way to the yellows. So very, very, very cool to have that ability. I mean, pretty, outright amazing. And in the end, what this image looked like when I worked on it, let me go back here to the library, and I'll show you what my finished one came out to be like. And this was my finish for that image. And again, you saw what the original looked like. And what I've done here, and again, I could spend, I could just work on this image the whole time, but I want to make use of doing other things. I went in locally, and you saw on the original, the highlights were kind of hot here. So I brought the highlights down, and then I painted in some color in the area here. I painted in a little bit more detail, bringing this up. I lightened the water in this area. and then painted in the contrast and darkened the underside of this iceberg, and then just went in with a small paintbrush and lightened up these areas where we were getting this sort of neon effervescence coming out of the iceberg. And, just, again, pretty amazing. Let me see if I have the before, the full, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's go back to the develop module here. And so, well, this had worked. The last thing when I started painting the shadows in, that's the before and that's the after. Going back to the original, going back to the original, we actually had this, and we'll hit reset here. And, it's misbehaving on me a bit, but that's why they're in beta. So let's go to reset. So that was the actual, that was the starting point, and that was my finish. Pretty, and again, not ever going into Photoshop, which is pretty outrageous. Brian, I'm gonna pick another one to go work on. But are there specific questions about this image or questions about what I've done, and then I can bump it up a bit?
There is one good question about the image itself, but it's regarding one of our, I think, our mutual favorite products, and that's the Color Checker Passport, and that was by Lance. And so Lance said, the question was, how do you go about shooting the Color Checker Passport in the field? Does it matter that if you use direct sunlight or shadow light around the iceberg?
I'm using, I'm actually doing a dual luminant one, and I'm creating one that I'll show you. Actually, let me go in. I think there actually is a shot of me holding it, and you can see how it's done. We did it in Peterman Island. So let's just let this load here. And Peterman Island is right here. Was it Peterman? I believe it was Peterman that we did it. There's Eric Miola. Let's see. And of course, I could just go to my keywords and look, Brian, but it's, sometimes we, and maybe I should just go to my keywords. Maybe it's better to go to my keywords. So let me just go here.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm enjoying looking at all the progression of these images and what you're doing with them.
Yeah, oh, and there's a bug. Okay, so double-clicking on, that's a new bug I just found. So double-clicking on the number of keywords doesn't necessarily work. And this is why we tend not to use betas for demos, but hey, that's the way the ball goes. So let's try this, and if not, here we go. So that is actually a frame with the color checker, and the actual frame we used. So I didn't have my finger over this, but I'm just holding it up and then running it based on the light we have, and doing. I did a couple that are called dual illuminant ones, where we're doing it in sunlight and in clouds, and then mixing them, and they're pretty. I mean, they're pretty solid. They were about as awesome as it gets. Anything else there?
One quick question. Two questions that came up, or actually it was by Steve from earlier, regarding lens profiles.
Yep.
So with lens profiles, are you able to create your own and save them, or is this still just using stock?
I'm pretty much using, I've done both. I'm very happy with 90% of the lens corrections that are here. I found, some lenses that are particularly notoriously a pain in the wazoo. I have done custom ones on, but as a general rule, I've been pretty happy with everything.
Two really quick questions as well. First is there a few people are asking what, if any, replacement to the fill light slider is there in the develop module?
Okay.
And then the second
So
question is, in terms of setting the white, how do the white and black points relate to setting clipping points?
okay, two good questions. Well, you'll notice there is no fill light, and there's no fill light because we now really have separate control over those highlights and shadows, and the deep shadows and the deep highlights. So what fill light used to do, the good part of what fill light used to do, is it used to basically fill in the shadows. But as you started to crank fill light, you ended up typically with a lot of artifacting. So literally taking separate control over each of the aspects of the image really totally allows us to do away with without having fill light at all. Let's play with this one, or maybe we go to a really hardcore one. Well, let's take this one. So I'm going to make a virtual copy so you can see what the original looks like. And now on the original, on the virtual, I'm going to hit reset. So that's going to take me back to the way it was shot. And now I'm going to make another virtual copy so that when I work on this image, we'll be able to come back to the way it was shot. I hope that makes sense. So I am going to delete this virtual copy. I am going to delete that virtual copy. And now this one we can work on and make progress, and then go back and show you what this looks like. So again, I'm going to save time here. I would have done the lens correction. I would do the profile. But let's just get into sort of the guts of some of the interesting stuff on this particular image. So this is a case where we have a absolutely huge iceberg towering up through an ice field, and we're actually able to pull up next to this, so we're actually seeing the bottom of this iceberg coming through the water. The difference in f-stops between the sky and deep under this iceberg, probably 8 stops. Typically, this actually would have been something that I might have wanted to do in on one, pretty incredible to be able to address those issues here. So I'm going to actually go right into my brushes. I'm going to actually leave this as is for now and open up my brushes. And the first thing I'm going to do is I want to start to open up the water. So I'm going to increase exposure a bit just to start out with. Turn on auto masking. And I'm going to just start painting in here. And auto masking is actually doing an amazing job of finding the edge of that iceberg. Come right up the side here. And by using the O key, as I start to do this, you'll see the mask. So there, the mask is actually, they've done a lot of work on the mask. You see, that perfectly found these edges. I didn't, even with a large brush, I've gone over none of this part of the image at all. And I'm just going to clean this up here. We'll now get rid of the mask with the O key again. And now I'm going to start to open that area up. Now, I'm going to open it up by opening up exposure a bit. And then I'm going to go into my shadows. And I'm going to open up the shadows. And you can see this is sort of that equivalent of fill light that I'm starting to play with. But the results are much, much, much better. And then I'm going to go into, actually what I'm going to do is set that. So that now I'm going to have a new one because it was so much darker over here. Now I'm going to start a new pin, if you will, just on this side. So I can lighten that part up separately and come over here and lighten this part up separately. And now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a bit of saturation to this one. And we'll leave it for there for right now. Now I go back to the overall image. So I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to increase my overall exposure a bit. And you can see when I do that, I'm going to want to go back and edit these and bring these down to tone them down a bit. I'm going to use my white balance tool, and let's make the loop a little smaller. Just to change that color temperature a bit. And I'm also going to open up a gradient, and I'm going to drop a gradient down on the top from the corner, pulling it diagonal, so then I can darken that sky a bit, and I'm going to desaturate that sky a bit, bringing on sort of the grays there. I'm going to hit return. That sets that gradient. Then I'm going to pull another gradient down at an angle on the other side, right about there. Same thing. And then drop a gradient down just from the top to sort of fill in that area above there. And again, this becomes a starting point. I would have to go, clearly you can see this edge here, so I would go back and, clean some of that up. But again, pretty amazing to have gone, if you look at that area, we have an area where there's absolutely no detail, you can't see anything, and it's just like we've turned on a light bulb underneath that, underneath the iceberg. The final for that looks like this. And, this is with, softening up the edge in here, softening the edge up in here, but lightening this up and darkening the sky. And again, pretty, really amazing to be able to do that. I'm going to bump it up a bit now. We'll do a couple of other things that are, approach some other features that are kind of neat. Let me just go to my library for a minute, and let's go to grid. And a simple one, we'll do this one, and then we can do the biggie. Yeah, let's do this one. This is actually kind of an interesting, fun one to play with. So again, I'm going to go into Develop, and you'll notice that now you'll notice that I'm actually in PV 2010, the old process version, and this raises another interesting point. We have an exclamation point. I can update the process version. One thing, and you should all listen very carefully to this, in previous versions, the process version was always awesome, the new one, and I actually told people you probably want to apply it to all your images except ones that you've done print editions on. I have a very different attitude now, because you will see some images that change dramatically. I think you should do this image by image, but particularly on this image, I am going to update the process version. And you can, okay, that's a perfect example, a perfect example of how much the image can change by updating the process version. I mean, that was huge. And you don't want to have to redo all your images. So very good point is that when it comes to the process version, be selective. All of your new images will automatically have PV 2012. But be selective about what images you decide to update or not. I'm now going to go ahead and do a virtual copy of this. So again, we have a starting point. And we'll hit reset to get us all the way back to the way it was as it was shot. And that's the way this image was shot. So we'll make one more virtual copy. And then we'll delete that virtual copy. And then how did we get from this image to the final, which is that, pretty amazing. And actually, it's not quite popping in there. So anyhow, we'll move forward. First thing I did is I went in here and in this case, I am going to hit auto, which is going to spread my histogram as best as it can and get it to at least a halfway decent starting point. My goal for this image was I thought this would be pretty neat if I could emphasize the blue and then drop everything else to grayscale and also clean up a couple of dust spots on the sensor like the one right there. So first thing I did in this case is I created a gradient. And the gradient is going to start out with very low saturation. I'm going to drop the gradient and hold down the shift key, which is going to apply the gradient from the top down perpendicular. Drop that gradient almost all the way down to the bottom. And I'm going to lower my exposure and lower saturation even a bit more. Hit return, that sets that gradient. I'm going to come up from the bottom and put a gradient on the water because I want to darken the water as well. So right up to there. And we'll just drop that one down to get the water almost black. Hit return. Now I'm going to start working on the part of the basic panel. I'm going to increase my contrast fairly dramatically to emphasize those clouds. I'm going to increase clarity. I'm going to drop down my shadows to, again, darken the shadows and emphasize the highlights by opening up the highlights just a hair. Bring my upper highlights down a bit. And now I'm going to go back in locally. So I'm going to pick a brush. And I'm going to add a little exposure. I'm going to add some saturation. And I'm going to lower the color temperature just a hair to emphasize just the blue on this iceberg. We'll make a smaller brush, put on auto masking, and you get the idea here. And it's also very different doing this when you're really concentrating on doing this and not doing a webinar at the same time, but you get the general idea here. So this iceberg was cleaned up and all of that was accentuated. Come right to the edge. And you can see that auto masking really actually allows it to get right down to the edge. I'm going to bring down exposure just a little bit, which will make it, there we go. That's probably a little bit more believable. The H will hide the pins. And then I went in with some overall saturation. And then I dropped another gradient down on the top, all the way down with just a lack of saturation, but essentially about the same exposure. So I'm going to drop that all the way down. And I'm going to do the same thing with a brush with a lack of saturation, just a lack of saturation. And we'll make this a bigger brush. And just sort of paint out this area. And we had the wrong color temperature in there. That needs to be adjusted. But again, you start to get the idea. And again, with a bit of tweaking and whatnot, what we are able to get from that, the final looked like this. Actually, the final has been magically deleted when I went back to the old process version. So that is something to be mindful of. And this is why you also want to do this kind of stuff only on images you're willing to sacrifice at this point. And let's go on to a really a really big job, one that you know, I think really shows the capability of what Lightroom can do. And we have 3 choices here. I'll show you each of the finals, and then I'll just decide which one I'm going to actually work on. That's one. That's the. This is another one. Come on. Again, you're seeing you're seeing beta problems. Let's move to the next image, please. This is why we advise against betas sometimes. Hopefully we didn't freeze altogether. Wow. Oh, there we go. It's waking up on me, Brian. Very interesting that I have a different image in the Navigator right now. Actually, there we go. Okay, so that's the other image, and then the third image that I could play with is this one over here. And you know, all of these are really, really, really dramatic examples, and I think we'll use. I think this one is actually a pretty decent one to play with. So let it load. Brian, are there questions to answer while Lightroom is trying to catch up here?
Yeah, I was going back and forth with Phil. We were talking about color spaces, and
yep.
I think it's warranted to bring up here. So, like for instance, the 5D2.
Okay.
If your camera, so Lightroom recommends ProPhoto RGB for its color space, but if your camera,
well, let's correct that. Lightroom's develop module only works in it is ProPhoto. That is the color space for the develop module. The library module can rendering 1-to-1s will render in a ProPhoto variation, or you can render standard, which is in Adobe 98.
But what about cameras that can only capture in either sRGB or Adobe 98? Do you?
Well, if you're shooting RAW, there is no color space.
Right. Thank
so
you.
if we're talking about a JPEG workflow, then Lightroom is going to deal with JPEGs in essence differently in how it's handling it fundamentally than it would with a raw file.
Sounds good.
So on this one, just first of all, so you can see the history of this. Let's open up. Let's get the develop module to load this, and I think probably the reason that it's slowed down here is, okay, so you get an idea of how many things were actually done to this image, and maybe what we can do, which might be interesting, is to just go back in history, and you'll get an idea of what was actually done. If I can get the history panel to scroll here, let's open and close presets. So it's not scrolling, and it should be. Let's see if I can get the scroll bar to activate. There we go. Okay. So, you know, that's a pretty big history. We started out here. That's the way it looked like when it was shot. Now, very, very interesting. It was, and a very good lesson here, I think, photographically, and I think, Brian, you'll get a kick out of this. I have an expression that there's no such thing as bad light. There's only light. How you deal with it creatively is what it looks like. This is the end of our time out on the water this day. A storm is moving in, and there's really nothing worse perceptually than fog on white ice. I mean, it was actually almost vertigo at times because you just couldn't see anything. That is literally what this image looked like. And the unfortunate part is that a lot of photographers actually didn't shoot because they said the light sucks. There's nothing here. And you know what I could see with my own eye, even through the fog, was God. You know, there's still this effervescent quality of these blues that are just amazing. So, updating it first to the current process version and doing some, you know, just basic developing, building contrast in this image, we're able to at least build enough contrast where we can start to see an image. Now, you know, I ask myself, image, what do you want done to me? I want to bring the sky down a lot. I want to paint in shadows here. I want to paint in and open this up. So as we go through this, you'll see, I'll just take you through each of the steps so you can see literally what was done. This is playing around with the sliders at this point, but let's get up to our shadow slider. So I want to, I'm first concerned with, I thought that if I brought down the entire image, I'm reaching to the image on the screen in my hand, which you obviously can't see, but I thought if I brought the entire image down as a very dark, moody concept, and then selectively started to lighten the image, I would be able to retain this really neat quality in the background, which was this fog, but not make it fog, really make it like these dark storm clouds. So as we start to move through, we'll come up to where I tint, and now what I've done is selectively taken just this area and opening up this area, and we're already starting to, have some pretty neat effects. Go through with different brush strokes, and just to, let's come up to these brush strokes where I'm now darkening the sky more. As we come up to this batch of brush strokes, and again, this is how you play. Too much, so I'm taking some of that away. I come back up. Let's go to some of the highlight adjustments. This is tweaking just parts of the highlight. There we go. So I'm starting to bring down these highlights because I want these areas to really start to glow. As we come up to further up here, adding, again, brush strokes back into, again, selectively start to deal with, this is starting to deal with just painting in a little tungsten and a little bit of highlight on here. But again, this is kind of too much. It's, totally phony looking. But, that's the starting point. I then updated the color temperature a bit. I updated the exposure on that. We start moving into other brush strokes further up. Let this one take. Lightroom is certainly being tested here with this amount of layers. Okay, so now I've dulled these down. They're much more believable. I've painted in black in this area underneath and in here. And then as we start to come up, updating the overall exposure, starting to then add graduated filters, bringing down the sides and then opening up this area. So there's bringing down the top more. And eventually right on up to the last one, which is this. And I mean, really amazing if you look at where this image started, which was an image that was so flat and so muted that, and again, most of the photographers said they were just not going to shoot because there was simply nothing there. And when we started to work on these in the boat, people were, literally blown away, like, wow, how did you do that? Well, it's, that's what it's all about. The graphic quality of this was here. The basic light structure was here. It was just very muted. But even going around this background area and painting in some of these icebergs back here and back here, totally something that's doable. We'll go to one other one, and let's do some work on this one. I guess maybe let's do this one next. And actually, will paint this one. We're starting to run out of time, but okay. Again, let me answer a couple questions, Brian, and then I can finish up with doing some more work on this one.
There were a few questions about the color checker. I was just fielding a lot of the questions here. Einar wants to know if you actually swam in Antarctica this time.
I tell Einar that I did not because there was no place where I could get in the water with an iceberg. It would have just been cold water. But I did, just for Einar in particular and a few other people, I did do things like this, which is a very big no-no. I actually went out on the icebergs, and this was a floating iceberg, and did quite a few photographs actually on the icebergs, which is another big no-no. But hey, that's what icebergs are for. So a yes and a no there. This one, again, pretty amazing, that same kind of light. So if we go ahead and let's go back here to our starting point, and then I will make a, okay, so that's, again, that's my starting point. This time I'm going to actually make a, I'll make a virtual copy of it from this state. Let me just go back and get this one clean so I don't lose the history on that, just because it was a lot of work. Let that come in for a second. Okay, so again, you know, you pull up in a Zodiac. The day is we're losing light. This is really what it looked like, and you know, you can barely see anything back here. The ice is almost the same color as the sky. And again, people just aren't even shooting. It's sort of like, you know, oh, this would be neat with good light. Well, so what can we do? Well, I started out doing a basic adjustment just to, you know, see where Lightroom would take me. I hit auto, and, you know, that becomes a starting point. Okay, that's too hot for me, so I'm going to bring down overall exposure to a better starting point, because, again, what I'm going to want to do here is bring the background down, create contrast and drama and color in here. But let's start with the water, because I think it's a really easy one to start see some very dramatic effects with. So I'm going to open up my brushes. I'm going to paint in some color temperature. So I'm going to lower the color temperature a bit. I'm going to increase saturation, and I'm going to increase exposure. And let's make my brush a little smaller. And we have auto masking on, and we will start to paint in the area of the water, which is really the iceberg underwater. Is what you can see the line that comes right down the side there, and we're able to open up the part of the iceberg that is underwater and get that squared away. I'll come right up to the line there. And come in here, come over to this area where there's some more that's underwater. And, you know, that's, again, even right there is pretty incredible to see just that as a difference. I'm going to hit return. That sets that. Now I know I want to bring my sky down quite a bit, so I'm going to take my shadows down. I'm going to take my exposure down. I'm going to take saturation down, and I'm going to start to add some drama. That's a bit too much, but we'll add some drama into the background. And again, we can always clean this up after the fact, which is the other part that's kind of nice. So we're going to do that just to get it started. And we'll fill this in. Okay, the O key, let me just finish this part here. The O key will show the mask, and if I press the Alt key, I can subtract from the mask. So I'm going to clean up the parts that I went over in the iceberg first, and just clean this up a bit here and here and here. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the O. We can come back to that pin in a bit. I'm going to hit return and set that. Now I want to start doing some general work on the iceberg. I'm going to increase contrast. I'm going to increase clarity. I'm going to keep my color temperature down. I'm going to drop my shadows significantly. And just start to go to darken this, and then actually we're going to come back and lighten this because that was way too much. Let's take that point. Okay, now selectively let's go in here and open this up a bit. Oh, was I on edit? Yeah, I'm on edit, okay. So here, and what we actually want to do is increase saturation, my mistake. So now we're starting to get the blues. And again, you know, this is a starting point. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do to make this believable. But in going back through this and really spending time, you know, working on each of these individual areas and doing it sectionally from top to bottom, we were able to go and end up with a final that looked like this. Come on, load. And my brushes are actually being a little odd today, I think, because Lightroom is just bogged down. But this is, you know, this was my final, and it's really, you know, it's taking small sections at a time. These are the areas, you know, I've darkened this, I've lightened areas in here, darkened this, lighten areas in here, darken the whole background, and just, you know, I mean, pretty amazing, because you're really, I think it would have been almost impossible to get an image to do this in previous versions of Lightroom. Fairly easy to do this kind of stuff in Photoshop. Well, I shouldn't say fairly easy. I should say a lot of work, but able to do this kind of thing in Photoshop, but fairly tough to get this kind of advancement in Lightroom. And again, to just go over what the sliders really do, we have the ability, actually let's go to basic first. We have in the basic slider, we have overall exposure, which is, you know, lightening and darkening the entire image, contrast for the entire image. Highlights are controlling our highlights, but not the brightest highlights. The brightest highlights are controlled separately with whites. We have shadows, which are controlling our dark shadows, but not the darkest shadows. The darkest shadows are controlled with our blacks. All the sliders can be pushed pretty much as far as you want. And, you know, for those of you that haven't downloaded the beta, lots and lots of cool stuff. Two completely new modules, the book module and the map module. One of the coolest things that we do have, and I will do another webinar on it, but we have the ability to have soft proofing, and I can turn soft proofing on, get a paper white for a background. I can go in and go right ahead and pick my paper profiles and go ahead and then adjust the profiles and see what's in and out of gamut selectively. So if I choose a, so you'll see here that is a monitor gamut warning. That is the stuff that's on my monitor that's out of gamut. Very, very interesting. I'm working on NECs, and this entire image on my Apple shows out of gamut. But on the NECs, that's the part that's out of gamut. If I actually go to the soft proof, I can put it on this part of the clipping, and I can show that actually right now, none of this image is being clipped. So, you know, totally good to go for printing or making subtle adjustments. But very, very, very neat to have a real soft proofing in here. And again, I'll probably do another entire webinar on how to do that and what we're looking for and how to go about that.